They say age is just a number, but this story will challenge everything you believe about that saying. What could drive a young teenage boy to commit an act so unspeakable, so horrifying, that it left an entire nation in shock? Was there something deeper? A hidden affair? A dark secret between the murderer and the victim? The answers will leave you questioning everything. Stay locked in as we unravel the chilling truth behind this tragic and unexpected story. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe, like, share, and comment to uncover the mystery that shook the nation to its core. This is a story you'll never forget. In April 1999, in the city of Hikari, Yamaguchi Prefecture, Japan, a serious murder case occurred that shocked the entire nation. The perpetrator, an 18-year-old young man, brutally murdered a mother and her child and then committed an act of necrophilia with the mother's body. The case, with its cruel details, caused public outrage. Yet the perpetrator was protected by the law simply because he was not yet 20 years old. What shocked the public even more was that during the trial, the murderer's lawyer argued that the cause of intercourse with the deceased was because the perpetrator believed that by introducing his sperm into the victim's body, she would come back to life. Who was this murderer? What led to the tragic event where a minor could so heartlessly kill an infant and her mother? Before we get into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our latest videos. On the night of April 14, 1999, a typical evening like any other, in the town of Hikari, Yamaguchi Prefecture, Japan, 23-year-old Hiroshi Mamura had just finished a long day of work and was eagerly heading home at 7 p.m. He entered the narrow alley leading to the house where he lived with his beloved wife, Yayoi Mamura, and their 11-month-old daughter, Yuka. But as soon as he placed his hand on the door, Hiroshi felt that something was wrong. The house, usually filled with the lively chatter of Yayoi, was unusually silent today. A sense of unease rose within Hiroshi as he realized the door was unlocked. He froze, doubt clearly visible in his eyes. This wasn't like Yayoi, his wife, who was always meticulous about every little detail, especially with baby Yuka in the house. Hiroshi slowly pushed the door open, and the sight inside left him stunned. The usually tidy and orderly was now in disarray, everything disrupted as if someone had deliberately shattered the pieces of their home. An unsettling feeling overwhelmed Hiroshi as he called out for his wife and child, but the only response was a terrifying silence. With each passing second, Hiroshi's fear grew more intense. He searched every room, checked every corner, but there was no sign of his wife or daughter. Until he approached the wardrobe in the bedroom. A bad premonition made him hesitate. The door was slightly ajar and he could see the edge of a familiar blanket peeking out. His heart raised, his hands trembling. As he touched the door and opened it, the sight that met Hiroshi's eyes beyond anything he could have ever imagined. Yayoi's lifeless body wrapped tightly in a blanket partially unclosed. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tears streamed down his face. The man who had been cheerful just minutes ago was now engulfed in sorrow and despair. In his panic, Hiroshi gathered all his strength to call the police. About 30 minutes later, the police arrived. They quietly went about their work, searching the entire house for clues about what had happened. But the pain didn't end there. During their search, the police discovered something even more horrifying. The tiny body of Yuka, Hiroshi and Yayoi's daughter, was found stuffed inside a black plastic bag hidden on top of a storage cabinet. The home that was once filled with laughter and happiness was now only a scene of death and despair. Hiroshi watched in agony as the police carried the bodies of his wife and daughter out of the house. Questions flooded his mind. What had happened? Who could be so heartless? And why his family? That night turned into an endless nightmare for Hiroshi, a nightmare from which he knew he would never awake. Just 4 days after the horrifying crime, the police located and arrested the perpetrator at an internet cafe near the crime scene. What shocked the public even more was that the murderer was a teenager, just 18 years old. His name was Takayuki Atsuki, born on March 15, 1981. The fact that someone so young could commit such a brutal act sent shockwaves throughout Japan. According to Takayuki, around 2 p.m. on April 14th, he had meticulously planned and prepared to carry out his heinous crime. He disguised himself as a plumber, carrying all the necessary tools like a professional, and broke into Yayoi's home with an unremarkable appearance and inconspicuous clothing. Takayuki easily approached the house without arousing suspicion from the neighbors or anyone else. As soon as he entered the house, Takayuki immediately lunged at Yayoi, grabbing her tightly. However, unlike what he had anticipated, Yayoi fiercely resisted. She struggled, trying desperately to break free from the tight grip of her attacker. In her panic, she screamed, fighting back with all her small, fragile strength. But the strength of a frail woman like her was no match for the brutality and determination of a depraved individual. Faced with Yayoi's fierce resistance, Takayuki became even more violent. He didn't hesitate to use force to subdue her. Yayoi's cries for help were abruptly silenced as Takayuki taped her mouth and nose shut. Suffocating her, Yayoi grew weaker, and eventually she suffocated to death in extreme pain and terror. Takayuki's perverse eyes focused on Yayoi as she lay dying, indicating that his crime didn't end there. After murdering Yayoi, Takayuki proceeded to commit an unspeakable act on her lifeless body. Meanwhile, little Yuka, the 11-month-old daughter of Yayoi and Hiroshishi, witnessed the entire ordeal. In sheer terror and despair, baby Yuka tried to crawl onto her mother's body, but it was too late. Fearing that the baby's cries would alert the neighbors, Takayuki pulled the baby away from Yayoi, not once but twice, before ultimately strangling the child with a rope until she too lost her life. Takayuki Atsuki, an 18-year-old teenager, had taken the lives of 2 innocent souls on that fateful afternoon, and yet he continued to live as if nothing had happened. He even didn't hesitate to sit and play games at an internet cafe near the crime scene, showing no sign of fear or remorse. The brutal murders in Hikari Town sparked a massive wave of outrage across Japan. People were not only heartbroken by the tragic deaths of Yayoi Mamura and baby Yuka, but also deeply angered by the inhumane cruelty of the perpetrator. In June 1999, the Yamaguchi District Prosecutor's Office filed charges in the Supreme Court, demanding the harshest punishment, the death penalty for Takayuki Atsuki for the horrific crimes he had committed. However, disappointment swept in when this charge was dismissed. The primary reason was that Takayuki was not yet 20 years old, the age at which one is legally considered an adult in Japan. At the time of the crime, Takayuki was only 18, and thus he was still classified as a minor. According to Japanese law, minors are entitled to protection, both physically and mentally. This legal stipulation caused widespread outrage, as many people believed that Takayuki's crime had far exceeded the limits of what could be considered juvenile delinquency. What stands out in this case is not a tense battle of wits between the police and a cunning criminal, because after committing the crime, Takayuki left behind plenty of evidence and clues at the scene. These clues were so evident that the police were easily able to trace him and quickly apprehend him. What truly captivated the public was the arduous journey of Hiroshi Mamura, as he sought justice for his wife and daughter. At the first trial in March 2000, Hiroshi Mamura appeared holding a photograph of his wife and daughter, but as he stepped into the courtroom, he was immediately stopped. The judge argued that the victim's family holding the photograph in court could influence the defendant's psychology and emotions. Takayuki Atsuki, who was still considered a minor under Japanese law, entered the courtroom with a cold, emotionless demeanor. The slippers on his feet further highlight his contempt for the court, the law, and especially the victim's family. He stood before the court without a trace of remorse, and the room fell silent in the face of the chilling, nonchalant attitude of the young killer. Takayuki began explaining his motive with a tone of excitement. He claimed that violating Yayoi after she had died was not a random act, but was to follow a resurrection ritual described in the book Reincarnation of Demons by the novelist Futaro Yamada. Takayuki stated this with such seriousness, as if he genuinely believed in the absurdity of it. Leaving those in the courtroom feeling deeply unsettled, he further explained that placing baby Yuka in the closet was to help Duran, the beloved cartoon character of many Japanese children, step out from a time machine, and the reason he disguised himself as a plumber, Takayuki said, was simply to mimic Super Mario, the video game character. His statements were not only bizarre, but also so delusional that it seemed as though he had blurred the lines between reality and fantasy, between life and comic book stories or video games. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom as no one knew how to respond to the killer's fantastical and deranged testimony. Everyone remained silent, their hearts filled with fear and disgust. How could an 18-year-old boy view murder as a game, as a mere imitation of fictional characters he admired? After finishing his testimony, Takayuki Atsuki suddenly lifted his chin, smirking it arrogantly, his gaze unflinchingly directed straight at the victim's family. His eyes held a challenging look, as if to say he feared nothing and felt no remorse. Takayuki stood there staring at those engulfed in grief, as if wanting to deepen their pain. It wasn't until his defense attorney signaled that Takayuki reluctantly bowed his head, pretending to show regret. In a cold voice, he said, "I'm very sorry, I did something unforgivable." Despite the insincerity in Takayuki's words, the judge interpreted this as a sign that the offender had a desire to repent. These words were considered a mitigating factor, leading to an astonishingly lenient sentence for Takayuki. What do you think would be the court's final verdict on this case towards Takayuki? Stay with us as subscribe, like, share and comment to share your thoughts on this story. The judge immediately dismissed the charge of life imprisonment, instead proposing a reduced sentence based on Takayuki's remorse. He stated that with this attitude of repentance, Takayuki might only face 7 to 8 years in prison and would be protected under juvenile law. In fact, if Takayuki demonstrated good behavior while incarcerated, he could be released even earlier. The entire courtroom felt as if it had been frozen after hearing this verdict, amid the heavy atmosphere. Takayuki's defense lawyer didn't hesitate to raise his hand in a victory sign, as if mocking the victim's family right in front of the judge. This action ignited the fury of Hiroshi Mamura, who had endured too much pain since losing his wife and daughter. Immediately after the trial, in a rage he could no longer contain, Hiroshi held a press conference. Standing before the media cameras, he spoke with a trembling but determined voice. "I am devastated by this sentence. Where are the rights of the victims? Where is the justice for their family? If this is the judge's decision, then once he is released, I will kill him with my own hands." He knew that he could no longer rely on anyone else to seek justice for the loved ones who had been taken from him. Throughout the lengthy, intense trial, the criminal Takayuki Atsuki was not only protected by the loopholes in the legal system, but also displayed cunning and deceitfulness that was hard to believe. Each time he appeared in court, it was as if Takayuki was performing in a play where he was the lead actor, always knowing how to change the script to create confusion and distort the truth. At every hearing, Takayuki would present entirely different statements, often contradicting what he had said previously. One day, he would admit to part of his crime, but the next day he would deny everything, blaming his circumstances or even the victim. This continuous and unexpected shift in his testimony not only complicated the investigation, but also made convicting him a dead end. Takayuki Mang. While in prison, Takayuki continued to correspond with some friends through letters, but instead of expressing remorse, his letters were filled with arrogance and disdain, provoking anger in anyone who read them. One of the letters Takayuki sent to a friend in prison was made public, and it quickly became the focus of attention. In the letter, Takayuki not only compared his acts of murder and rape to the behavior of an animal, but he also blatantly denied his own responsibility. He wrote, "It's just a male dog walking down the street, and it happens to meet a cute female dog, and the male dog naturally mounts her. Is this also a crime?" His words were filled with offense and inhumanity, as if he didn't understand or deliberately refused to understand that his crime had taken the lives of 2 innocent people and caused unbearable pain to their family. But what was even more frightening was the arrogance and contempt for society that Takayuki revealed in the letter. He continued, "In the end, this world is ruled by evil. 7-8 years from now, when I get out of prison, you'll all have to throw me a grand party to welcome me." When this letter was published, it caused public outrage. Takayuki's brazen words and defiant attitude not only deepened the grief of the victims' families, but also sparked a strong backlash in public opinion. After the press conference ended, Hiroshida Mamura was invited by prosecutor Yoshida into his office, where Yoshida confided, "As a father with a young daughter, he couldn't imagine anyone being so heartless as to murder a child crawling towards her mother. If the law cannot make someone like that pay for their crimes, then what good is the law? He didn't support the trial's outcome. Even if his superiors opposed him, he was determined to condemn the verdict. Even if he failed 100 times, he would try again, and for the first time make Takayuki pay. After hearing the prosecutor's words, Hirotoshi Mamura suddenly felt a renewed sense of purpose. At 10:30 p.m., Hirotoshi appeared on a national television's news program. He wore glasses, his face gaunt, but the anger and agitation were gone. Hiroshi Mamura pointed out that Japan's criminal procedure law completely fails to protect the rights of the victims' families, leaving them at a disadvantage. His statement sent shockwaves throughout the country. Japan seemed to wake up to the injustice that the legal system had caused. Even the then Prime Minister of Japan, Obuchi Keizo, could not ignore the power of Hiroshi's speech. He acknowledged that the current legal system had significant shortcomings in protecting the rights of the victims' families and promised to come up with a solution as quickly as possible. This promise from the Prime Minister sparked a new glimmer of hope for Hirotoshi and others fighting for justice. March 14, 2002, the case was opened and the family continued to petition the High Court, demanding that the defendant be sentenced to death. However, this request was again denied, with the reasoning that the defendant had committed the crime shortly after turning 18 and his thinking was still immature. Despite the rising anger and pressure from the public, the court decided to uphold the life sentence, arguing that it was an appropriate punishment for a young man who was not yet fully mature. On April 22, 2008, at the Supreme Court of Japan, with the support of 4,000 citizens, prosecutor Yoshida was determined to push for the highest possible sentence for Takayuki's capital punishment. This trial took place in a tense and dramatic atmosphere markedly different from the previous ones. Takayuki Atsuki, who had previously appeared calm and arrogant in earlier hearings, suddenly changed his strategy. In the crowded sentence hearing for the previous 8 years, this time he completely denied all previous accusations, causing confusion in the courtroom. Yoshida, with determination and experience, found himself facing a jury of 21 renowned defense lawyers, all siding with Takayuki. One with rigor leading the defense team was Yoshihiro Yasuda, a well-known lawyer who often defended the rights of defendants, especially in cases involving the death penalty. In this trial, the defense lawyer claimed that Takayuki had no intention of killing Yayoi and her daughter on that fateful night. He argued that Takayuki only meant to scare them, and his actions spiraled out of control, but he never intended to cause their deaths. In an attempt to mitigate his client's punishment, the defense presented a series of emotional arguments during the trial. He began by emphasizing the tragic circumstances surrounding Takayuki Atsuki, who, according to him, had endured the pain of losing his mother at a young age. The lawyer explained that Takayuki's mother had committed suicide, leaving an irreplaceable void in the defendant's heart. According to the lawyer, Takayuki became sorrowful and desperate without his mother leading him to commit the crime. The lawyer continued arguing that on the night of the crime, Takayuki had no intention of raping the victim when he entered the house. Instead, he was searching for the warmth he once received from his deceased mother. When Takayuki embraced Yayoi, the act stemmed from the unconscious need of a child longing for his mother's comfort. However, due to Yayoi's fierce resistance, Takayuki lost control, ultimately suffocating her to death. The lawyer asserted that Takayuki's actions were not premeditated murder, but rather the result of confusion and a loss of control in a stressful situation regarding the act of engaging with the victim's body after her death. The defense put forward a shocking argument. He stated that Takayuki believed that if he could deposit sperm into the victim's body, she would come back to life. To Takayuki, this was not an act of disrespect or abuse, but rather an attempt to revive Yayoi. The lawyer maintained that Takayuki's actions were not driven by malice, but by a misguided belief and ignorance. The defense also accused the prosecutor of deliberately portraying Takayuki as a malevolent figure to justify the demand for the death penalty. He argued that Takayuki was not a cold-blooded killer, but a lost young man, haunted by the pain of losing his mother. The lawyer stressed that the prosecutor had ignored these complex psychological factors and focused solely on painting Takayuki as a criminal beyond redemption. However, These defenses not only failed to convince the judge, but also sparked widespread outrage among the public, people across Japan following the case closely. They were outraged by the arguments justifying the heinous acts Takayuki had committed. They could not accept that someone who had brutally taken 2 lives was being portrayed as a victim, and they demanded a fair sentence to bring justice to the victim's family. The judge made an unexpected decision. He completely rejected the lawyer's defense, affirming that nothing could justify the brutal crime Takayuki had committed. After thoroughly reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the judge decided to sentence Takayuki Atsuki to death. This was a historic decision, as Takayuki became the first minor in Japanese legal history to be sentenced to death. This decision was seen as a major victory for the prosecution and those who had persistently fought for justice. However, Takayuki Atsuki's legal journey did not end there. While serving his sentence, things didn't go as planned. On February 20th, 2012, the Japanese Supreme Court unexpectedly overturned Takayuki's death sentence after determining that there was a serious error in the victim's autopsy report. This error raised many questions about the accuracy of the investigation process and made the death sentence impossible to be carried out. Once again, justice seems delayed. In 2014, Takayuki was transferred to Hiroshima prison, where he continued to be held while awaiting the final decision on his fate. By the end of 2016, Takayuki was still alive and his case remained unresolved. His future hung in the balance, not only as a question for Japan's legal system, but also as a lingering wound for those awaiting a final, fair and transparent verdict. This case, with its complex and unexpected developments, left a mark not only on the history of Japanese law, but also as a lesson on the difficulties and challenges of enforcing justice. It raised questions about how the legal system should handle serious crimes committed by minors and about balancing the protection of human rights with the demand for justice for victims. Do you think Takayuki deserves a death sentence? Comment your answers below and don't forget to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel.